In the autumn of 1871, travelers along the old Savannah Road in rural Georgia would often report hearing the same unsettling phenomenon. Voices carried on the wind, speaking in languages they couldn't understand, emanating from the ruins of what locals called Black Oak Plantation. The voices seemed to rise from the very earth itself, growing stronger with each passing storm, as if the land was trying to tell a story that had been buried for far too long. Before we uncover the dark truth behind these mysterious voices and the man who claimed to understand them, if you're drawn to stories that blur the line between history and horror, make sure to subscribe to Dark Heritage Files and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most chilling tales from America's forgotten past. And while you're here, tell us in the comments what city and country you're listening from. We love connecting with our global audience of mystery enthusiasts. Now let's dive into one of the most disturbing cases we've ever uncovered. To understand what really happened at Black Oak Plantation, we must first travel back to those final days of Reconstruction. According to the fragmented records and whispered accounts that have survived in the local archives, the story began to unfold in the most unexpected way. The year 1871 marked a tumultuous period in Georgia's history. 6 years had passed since the end of the Civil War, and the wounds of conflict still festered across the South. Reconstruction policies had transformed the social fabric of rural communities, leaving many plantations abandoned and their former owners scattered to the winds. It was against this backdrop of social upheaval that the mystery of Black Oak Plantation began to capture the attention of locals in Wilkes County. Black Oak Plantation had once been among the largest cotton operations in eastern Georgia, sprawling across nearly 3,000 acres of fertile bottomland along the broad river. The main house, a grand antebellum mansion with towering white columns and wraparound porches, had been built in 1823 by the original owner, Colonel Marcus Whitfield. For decades, the plantation had been home to over 200 enslaved people who worked the cotton fields under the brutal Georgia sun. But by 1871, the great house stood empty and crumbling, its paint peeling like diseased skin, its windows boarded up like closed eyes. The cotton fields had returned to wilderness, and the slave quarters had collapsed into piles of rotting timber. Only one structure remained occupied: a small overseer's cabin near the edge of the property, where a single man continued to live among the ghosts of the past. His name was Jeremiah Oak, and at 53 years old, he was the last human inhabitant of Black Oak Plantation. Jeremiah was a tall, gaunt man, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people who occasionally encountered him on his rare trips to the nearby town of Washington. He spoke little, moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying an invisible weight, and had developed the unsettling habit of pausing mid-conversation to listen to sounds that others could not hear. The townspeople of Washington knew Jeremiah as the former overseer of Black Oak, a position he had held for nearly 15 years before the war ended and the plantation system collapsed. Unlike many overseers who had fled south or west after emancipation, Jeremiah had simply remained. He had purchased the small cabin and a few surrounding acres from the estate when it was sold off in pieces, and there he had stayed, tending a small garden and living off the meager savings he had accumulated during his years of service. But it wasn't Jeremiah's hermit-like existence that had begun to worry the locals. It was his increasingly strange behavior, and more disturbing still, his claims about the voices. The first documented report of Jeremiah's unusual claims appeared in the Washington Gazette on October 15, 1871. A traveling Methodist preacher named Reverend Thomas Caldwell had stopped at Jeremiah's cabin seeking shelter from a sudden thunderstorm. What he experienced there would haunt him for the rest of his life. According to Reverend Caldwell's account, the storm struck just as evening fell, bringing with it howling winds that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small cabin. Jeremiah had welcomed the preacher inside and offered him coffee and cornbread, but as the storm intensified, the old overseer's behavior became increasingly erratic. He kept getting up from his chair, Reverend Caldwell wrote in his report, walking to the window and pressing his ear against the glass. When I asked what he was listening for, he looked at me with such intensity that I feared for my safety. "Don't you hear them?" he whispered. "They're calling out their names. Every night when the wind picks up, they call out their names." The preacher asked who they were, but Jeremiah only shook his head and returned to his vigil at the window. As the storm raged outside, Reverend Caldwell noticed that his host would occasionally nod or shake his head, as if responding to an unheard conversation. More disturbing still, Jeremiah began to whisper back to whatever he thought he was hearing, speaking in what sounded like fragments of different languages, some English, some that the preacher couldn't identify. "I am a man of God," Reverend Caldwell concluded in his account, "and I have witnessed many strange things in my ministry, but I have never felt such a presence of unrest as I did in that cabin. The very air seemed thick with sorrow and rage. When morning came, I left as quickly as I could, and I pray I never have cause to return to that cursed place." Word of the preacher's experience spread quickly through Washington and the surrounding communities. Soon, other stories began to surface. Hunters reported hearing voices echoing across the abandoned plantation grounds, especially on windy nights. A group of former slaves who had lived on the plantation before the war claimed they could hear their old work songs being carried on the breeze, sung by voices they recognized but knew belonged to people who had died years earlier. The local sheriff, a pragmatic man named Benjamin Crawford, initially dismissed these reports as superstition and war-induced hysteria. But as the accounts multiplied and became more detailed, he felt compelled to investigate. On a grey November morning, Sheriff Crawford rode out to Black Oak Plantation to speak with Jeremiah Oak directly. What Sheriff Crawford discovered during his visit would change everything. He found Jeremiah in a state of obvious distress, unshaven and hollow-eyed, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. The cabin itself was in disarray, with papers scattered across every surface and strange diagrams drawn on the walls in what appeared to be charcoal. "He looked like a man haunted," Sheriff Crawford would later tell his deputy, "but not by ghosts, by guilt." When pressed about the voices, Jeremiah's initial responses were evasive and contradictory. He claimed the voices were simply the wind playing tricks, but then would contradict himself by describing specific words and phrases he had heard. He insisted he was alone on the property, but then would reference conversations he had been having with them. Always them, never identifying who they were. It was during this interview that Sheriff Crawford made a disturbing discovery. While examining the papers scattered around Jeremiah's cabin, he found what appeared to be lists of names written in Jeremiah's careful handwriting. Hundreds of names, organized by date and accompanied by brief notes. Some entries read simply fever or injury, but others contained more ominous notations: attempted escape, insubordination, example made. When confronted with these lists, Jeremiah's composure finally cracked. With tears streaming down his weathered face, he confessed that the names belonged to enslaved people who had died on the plantation during his tenure as overseer. But these weren't just records of natural deaths or accidents. They were documentation of something far more sinister. "I kept track," Jeremiah whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that constantly seemed to blow around his cabin. "Every single one. I thought if I remembered their names, if I wrote them all down, maybe they would forgive me. Maybe they would stop calling to me in the night." Sheriff Crawford pressed for more details, and slowly, reluctantly, the truth began to emerge. During the final years of the war, as Union forces had pushed deeper into Georgia and rumors of emancipation had spread through the slave quarters, Black Oak Plantation had experienced several attempted uprisings. Colonel Whitfield, growing increasingly paranoid about rebellion, had authorized increasingly harsh punishments for any enslaved person suspected of planning escape or resistance. Jeremiah, as overseer, had been responsible for carrying out these punishments, but according to his tearful confession, what had started as whippings and confinement had escalated into something far more brutal. In the winter of 1864, following a failed escape attempt by 12 enslaved people, Colonel Whitfield had ordered what he called final measures. The revelation of mass executions at Black Oak Plantation sent shockwaves through the community, but Sheriff Crawford's investigation had only just begun. Jeremiah's confession, while disturbing, raised more questions than it answered. If dozens of enslaved people had been murdered on the plantation, where were the bodies? And why were the voices that Jeremiah claimed to hear always strongest during windstorms? Determined to uncover the full truth, Sheriff Crawford organized a thorough search of the plantation grounds. What his team discovered would prove to be far more extensive and horrifying than anyone had imagined. Using Jeremiah as a reluctant guide, the search party began exploring areas of the plantation that had been off-limits even to other white employees during the antebellum period. Jeremiah led them to a section of the property near the old cotton processing buildings, where the ground seemed strangely uneven and covered with an unusual amount of vegetation. He wouldn't look directly at the spot, Deputy James Morton recalled years later, just pointed in the general direction and then turned away, like he couldn't bear to see what we were about to find. The search team's shovels had barely broken the surface when they encountered the first wooden planks. Beneath a thin layer of soil and decades of accumulated leaves, they found the entrance to what appeared to be a storage cellar. But as they cleared away more debris, the true scope of the discovery became apparent. This wasn't just a single cellar. It was the opening to an extensive network of underground tunnels and chambers that stretched beneath a significant portion of the plantation grounds. The tunnels themselves were roughly hewn from the red Georgia clay, reinforced with timber beams that were now rotting and unstable. They had clearly been dug by hand, likely over a period of years, and connected several different areas of the plantation. But it was what the tunnels contained that truly horrified the search party. In chamber after chamber, they found human remains, dozens of skeletons, many still bearing evidence of violent death, crushed skulls, broken bones, clear signs of torture and execution. The bodies had been hastily buried in shallow graves within the tunnel system, sometimes stacked on top of each other in mass graves that spoke to the systematic nature of the killings. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery that explained the mysterious voices that had plagued Jeremiah and frightened visitors to the plantation. The tunnel system had been designed with a series of air vents that led to the surface at various points around the property. When wind blew across these vents, it created a natural phenomenon similar to the sound produced by blowing across the mouth of a bottle, but on a much larger and more complex scale. As the investigation continued, Sheriff Crawford made an even more chilling discovery in Jeremiah's cabin. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture, were detailed journals dating back to 1859. These journals, written in Jeremiah's meticulous handwriting, contained the most comprehensive documentation of systematic murder that Crawford had ever encountered. The journals revealed that the mass killings at Black Oak Plantation had not been impulsive acts of wartime brutality, but rather a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror that had begun years before the Civil War. Colonel Whitfield, paranoid about slave rebellions and influenced by increasingly radical pro-slavery ideologies, had convinced himself that the only way to maintain control was through what he called preventive elimination. Jeremiah's role in these atrocities went far beyond that of a reluctant participant following orders. The journals revealed that he had been the architect of the tunnel system, designing it not just as a place to hide bodies, but as an execution chamber where slaves could be tortured and killed without their screams being heard from the main house or quarters. The entries were clinical in their detail, describing methods of torture that had been refined over years of practice. Jeremiah had documented everything: which techniques produced the most fear in other slaves, how long victims could be kept alive during interrogation, even experiments in different methods of execution to determine which were most efficient. But as Sheriff Crawford read deeper into the journals, he discovered something that made the entire situation even more disturbing. Beginning in late 1864, as Union forces approached Georgia, the entries began to change. The clinical detachment gave way to increasing signs of mental distress. Jeremiah began questioning his actions, expressing doubts about the morality of what he was doing. The final entries, written in early 1865, just before the war's end, revealed a man on the brink of complete psychological collapse. Jeremiah wrote of nightmares, of hearing voices calling his name, of feeling watched by invisible eyes. He described Colonel Whitfield's increasing paranoia and the growing frequency of executions, sometimes killing enslaved people for infractions as minor as looking at a white person directly or humming while working. The last entry, dated April 10, 1865, was written in an increasingly shaky hand. The colonel ordered another 12 taken to the tunnels today. I can't do this anymore. But if I stop, if I refuse, he'll have me shot as a traitor. God help me. I think I would welcome it. The voices are getting louder. Even during the day now, I can hear them calling from beneath the ground. Sarah's voice, little Marcus, old Tom who tried to run last winter, they're all there, waiting for me in the dark. The final piece of the puzzle came when Sheriff Crawford confronted Jeremiah with the evidence from the journals. Faced with undeniable proof of his crimes, the last inhabitant of Black Oak Plantation broke down completely and confessed to everything. The true scope of the horror was staggering. Over a period of 6 years, from 1859 to 1865, Jeremiah Oak had participated in the systematic murder of over 200 enslaved people at Black Oak Plantation. The victims included men, women, and children as young as 12 years old, all killed for various infractions against the plantation's increasingly draconian rules. But Jeremiah's confession revealed an additional layer of horror that the journals had only hinted at. Colonel Whitfield hadn't acted alone in developing his theories of preventive elimination. He had been corresponding with other plantation owners throughout Georgia and the Carolinas, sharing techniques and comparing results. Black Oak had been part of a larger network of plantations where similar atrocities were taking place. We told ourselves we were protecting the natural order, Jeremiah sobbed as he confessed, that we were preventing a race war that would destroy the South. But the truth is, we were just monsters, evil, cowardly monsters who used fear to justify murder. Jeremiah explained that after the war ended and Colonel Whitfield fled to Mexico, he had remained at the plantation not out of loyalty or attachment to the land, but out of overwhelming guilt. He had sealed most of the tunnel entrances, but left several air vents open, hoping that the sounds they produced would serve as a permanent reminder of what had happened there. I deserve to hear their voices every night, he said. I deserve to never have peace. Every name on those lists, every person we killed, they should be remembered. They should be heard. The voices that had frightened visitors weren't supernatural manifestations, but rather the wind passing through the tunnel system where hundreds of victims had been buried. The complex acoustics of the underground chambers created sounds that could indeed resemble human voices, particularly during storms when the wind pressure was strongest. But for Jeremiah, tormented by guilt and driven to the edge of madness by what he had done, these natural sounds had taken on the quality of actual voices. His mind, desperate to find some form of punishment for his crimes, had transformed the wind in the tunnels into the voices of his victims, calling out the names he had so carefully recorded in his journals. Sheriff Crawford's investigation led to one of the largest recovery operations in Georgia's post-war history. Over the course of several months, teams of investigators and volunteers carefully excavated the tunnel system beneath Black Oak Plantation, ultimately recovering the remains of 247 individuals. Each set of remains was examined by a doctor from Atlanta, and where possible, identified using Jeremiah's meticulous records. Jeremiah Oak was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, making him one of the few overseers to face legal consequences for crimes committed during slavery. However, his trial was complicated by questions about the statute of limitations and the legal status of crimes committed against enslaved people before emancipation. Ultimately, he was convicted on federal charges related to crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison. He died in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta in 1874, reportedly still claiming to hear voices calling his name from beyond his cell walls. The victims of Black Oak Plantation were buried in a mass grave in the Washington City Cemetery with a simple stone marker bearing the inscription, "In memory of those whose names were forgotten, but whose voices will not be silenced." The marker was paid for by contributions from the local African-American community, many of whom had family members among the victims. Black Oak Plantation itself was eventually sold to a lumber company and cleared of all structures. Today, the land is part of a state forest, and few visitors know about the horrors that once took place there. But local residents still report strange sounds on windy nights, voices carried on the breeze, speaking names that seem to echo from the very earth itself. The case of Jeremiah Oak and Black Oak Plantation stands as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of the systematic violence that occurred on American plantations during the antebellum period. The discovery of his journals provided historians with unprecedented insight into the psychology of perpetrators and the methods used to maintain control through terror. But perhaps more importantly, the investigation ensured that the victims of Black Oak Plantation were finally acknowledged and remembered. Their names, so carefully recorded by the man who had participated in their murders, became part of the historical record. Their voices, whether carried by wind through underground tunnels or preserved in the testimony of survivors, would not be forgotten. The wind still blows across the former grounds of Black Oak Plantation, and sometimes on stormy nights, travelers along the old Savannah Road report hearing sounds that seem almost like voices. Whether these are simply the natural acoustics of the remaining tunnel vents or something more, no one can say for certain. But one thing is clear. The story of what happened at Black Oak Plantation serves as a reminder that some voices, once silenced, will find a way to be heard again. This dark chapter in American history shows us that the true horror often lies not in supernatural phenomena, but in the very real capacity for human evil. The voices on the wind at Black Oak Plantation were not the cries of restless spirits, but the echoes of a systematic campaign of murder that claimed hundreds of lives. Yet, in their own way, these voices, whether real or imagined, ensured that the victims were not forgotten and that their story would finally be told. What do you think about this horrifying piece of American history? Do you believe justice was truly served, or were there more perpetrators who escaped accountability? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as disturbing and compelling as we did, please subscribe to Dark Heritage Files, give this video a like, and share it with others who appreciate the darker corners of our past. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying stories are often the ones that really happened.